For 18 years, Silas Cole believed he was the punchline to a cruel joke, entirely forgotten by the world. No family, no money, no future. But the freezing woods of Washington state were hiding a secret, a rusted deadbolt that would unlock a terrifying legacy and a multi-million-dollar lie. The rain in Cle Elum, Washington doesn't just fall, it sinks into your bones and stays there. For 23-year-old Silas Cole, the damp cold was the only constant in a life defined by absence. Silas was a ghost living among the living. He worked the graveyard shift at a struggling lumber yard owned by a heavy-drinking man named Thomas Grigsby. Silas's job was to sort the offcuts, a mindless, back-breaking task that paid just enough in cash to keep him in a rusted, single-wide trailer on the edge of town. He didn't have friends. He didn't have a social media footprint. He didn't even have a bank account. What he had was a memory, sharp and jagged, of a Greyhound bus station in Spokane. It was November 12th, 18 years ago. Silas was 5 years old. His father, Richard Cole, had bought him a watery hot chocolate from a vending machine, sat him down next to a clanking cast-iron radiator, and zipped up Silas's oversized winter coat. "Stay right here by the heat, Si," Richard had said, his voice tight, his eyes darting toward the glass doors. "I just need to buy our tickets. Don't move." Silas didn't move. He sat by that radiator for 14 hours. He sat there until the hot chocolate went stone cold, until the station manager called child services, and until a police officer gently lifted him by the arm. He was swallowed by the foster system that night, bouncing from crowded homes in Seattle to remote farms in Yakima. He aged out at 18 with a garbage bag full of clothes and a profound, suffocating emptiness. He had been left alone for 18 years, convinced he was fundamentally unlovable, an unwanted burden discarded by a coward. The breaking point arrived on a bleak Tuesday morning. The lumber yard was shutting down. Grigsby handed Silas a final envelope containing $84 and wouldn't meet his eyes. "Sorry, kid," Grigsby muttered, turning back to his ledger. "Bank's foreclosing on the lot. You've got till Friday to clear your locker." Silas walked the 3 miles back to his trailer in the freezing drizzle, only to find a padlock on the door and an eviction notice stapled to the cheap siding. His landlord, Gary Higgins, hadn't even given him a warning. Silas sat on the muddy wooden steps of the trailer, shivering, the $84 burning a hole in his pocket. He had nothing. No home, no job, no safety net. He pulled his only possession of real value from his coat pocket, a small, faded canvas pouch. It was the exact pouch he had been wearing around his neck the day his father left him at the station. Inside was a heavy, oddly shaped brass key, etched with the numbers 040, and a thick, rigid leather tag. For 18 years, Silas had rubbed his thumb over that leather tag like a worry stone. It was blank, smooth, and meaningless. Or so he thought. Frustrated, freezing, and overwhelmed by a sudden wave of furious grief, Silas threw the pouch against the gravel driveway. It landed in a puddle of oily rainwater. When he bent down to retrieve it, wiping the mud away with his thumb, the water had darkened the worn leather. Silas froze. Faint, indented lines, previously invisible to the naked eye, suddenly contrasted against the wet, dark leather. They weren't just scratches, they were numbers. He held it up to the grey light of the sky. 47 degrees 25 minutes, 11.2 seconds north, 121 degrees, 23 minutes, 45.8 seconds west. They were GPS coordinates. A cold shock of adrenaline pierced through his despair. His father hadn't just left him a useless piece of leather. He had left a map hidden in plain sight, waiting for the day the leather got soaked, Or perhaps waiting for a day Silas was desperate enough to look closer. He pulled out his cracked, prepaid smartphone and typed the coordinates into the map application. The screen zoomed out, then zeroed in on a dense, completely undeveloped grid of the Cascade Mountains, deep in the Snoqualmie Pass. It was miles from any marked road, logging trail, or ranger station. It was the middle of absolute nowhere. With nothing left to lose, and a haunting desperation to understand why his life had been thrown away, Silas made a decision. He walked to the local hardware store, spent $40 on a cheap flashlight, a tarp, and protein bars, and used the rest to fill the tank of his battered 1998 Ford Ranger. He was going to find out what his father had left behind. The drive up I-90 was treacherous. The higher Silas climbed into the Cascades, the heavier the snow began to fall, turning the highway into a slick ribbon of white. His truck's heater was broken, and his breath plumed in the freezing cab. He took a remote exit near an old logging town, driving on poorly maintained service roads until the asphalt surrendered to dirt, and the dirt surrendered to thick, impassable pine forest. He parked the Ranger behind a cluster of dead fir trees, hoping it wouldn't be towed by the time he got back. If he got back. According to his phone's GPS, the coordinates were still 6 miles away, straight up a jagged, heavily wooded incline. Silas zipped his coat, grabbed his small backpack, and began to walk. The hike was brutal. The Pacific Northwest forest was a suffocating maze of moss-draped branches, rotting logs, and hidden ravines. Every step was a battle against the elements. Hours bled together. The silence of the deep woods was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of his boots and his own ragged breathing. By the time the GPS indicated he was within 500 feet, the sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. Silas's legs were burning, his hands completely numb. He pushed through a dense thicket of blackberry bushes, his face scratched and bleeding, and stumbled into a small, unnatural clearing. He stopped dead in his tracks. It wasn't a cave. It wasn't a buried box. It was a cabin. But it wasn't the dilapidated, rotting shack one would expect to find, abandoned in the deep woods for nearly 2 decades. It was a masterclass in architectural camouflage. The cabin was built flush against the side of a massive granite cliff, its roof angled to hold a layer of earth and living moss. The exterior walls were clad in treated dark timber and local stone, making it nearly invisible from the air or even from 100 yards away. It was fort-like, imposing, intact. Silas approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The windows were narrow, made of thick, reinforced glass, and covered from the inside by heavy steel shutters. There was no porch, just a heavy, solid oak door with a brass faceplate. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out the brass key etched with 040. For a second, he hesitated. If this key didn't turn, it meant his father was just a lunatic who had left him a random key and meaningless numbers. It meant Silas truly was nothing. He slid the key into the deadbolt. It fit perfectly. Silas held his breath and turned. Clack! The heavy metallic thud of the tumbler sliding back echoed in the quiet clearing. Silas pushed the door. Its hinges groaned, stiff from years of disuse, and a wave of perfectly dry, stale air washed over him. It smelled of cedar, old paper, and something distinctly metallic. He stepped inside, clicking on his flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, and Silas's breath hitched. The cabin was a time capsule, but it was pristine. No animals had gotten in. No water had leaked. There was a leather armchair in the corner, a small wood-burning stove, and a massive, heavy mahogany desk in the center of the room. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets. It didn't look like a hunter's retreat. It looked like a black site command center, but it was the far wall that caused the flashlight in Silas's hand to drop an inch. The entire right side of the cabin was covered in a massive corkboard, spanning at least 10 feet wide, and it was covered in hundreds of photographs. Silas walked toward it, his boots loud against the hardwood floor. He raised the light. The first photo was of him. He was 6 years old, sitting on the front steps of his first foster home in Seattle, looking miserable. Silas stepped closer, his mind spinning. The next photo was him at age 8, playing alone in a dusty schoolyard in Yakima. There was a photo of him at 12, getting a haircut at a cheap barber college. A photo at 16, walking out of a juvenile court with his strict foster mother, Mrs. Gable. There was even a photo of him taken just a month ago, loading timber at Thomas Grigsby's lumber yard in Clay Elam. He traced the edges of the newest photo, his fingers shaking violently. He hadn't been abandoned to the void. He hadn't been forgotten. Someone had been watching him, every single year, every single move. On the desk in the center of the room, sitting perfectly centered on a green leather blotter, was a thick manila envelope. Written on the front, in the sharp, slanted handwriting Silas remembered from his childhood, were 3 words. For Silas. Finally. Silas stared at the manila envelope, the beam of his flashlight trembling violently over the 3 handwritten words. For Silas. Finally. The silence of the cabin was deafening, pressing in on his eardrums like deep water. For 18 years, his entire identity had been constructed around the agonizing certainty that he was unlovable, unwanted, a broken thing left by a radiator in Spokane. Now, surrounded by a timeline of his own life meticulously pinned to a corkboard, that certainty shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He didn't want to open the envelope. Part of him wanted to run back out into the freezing Cascades, to return to the simple, crushing misery of his trailer. Hope was a dangerous, terrifying thing, but his frozen fingers moved on their own, breaking the brittle wax seal on the back of the heavy paper. Inside was a single, thick letter, written on yellow legal paper, a polished black USB drive, and a small, velvet-covered ledger. Silas unfolded the letter. The handwriting was rushed, the ink faded, but the emotion bled through the page. My dearest Silas, if you are reading this, it means you found the key. You solved the coordinates. And I am dead. I am so profoundly sorry, my boy. I am sorry for the cold bus station. I am sorry for the foster homes. I am sorry for every birthday I missed, every graduation I wasn't there for, and every night you went to sleep thinking your father didn't love you. I loved you enough to walk away. 18 years ago, I didn't abandon you. I saved your life. I was the lead hydrogeologist for Kensington Row Chemical. We were contracted to test the groundwater in the agricultural basin of eastern Washington. What I found wasn't just negligence, it was a massacre in slow motion. Kensington Row had been illegally injecting a highly toxic, proprietary solvent into the deep well aquifers to save billions in disposal costs. It was poisoning the water supply for 6 surrounding towns. When I brought the data to the executive board, they didn't fire me. They smiled, gave me a bonus, and 3 days later, my brakes failed on the I-90 pass. I survived the crash, but I understood the message. The men running Kensington Row, specifically a fixer named Graham Kessler, made it explicitly clear that if I went to the authorities, I wouldn't be the one who paid the price. You would be. You were 5 years old, Silas. You were my whole world. I couldn't run with you. They had the resources of a nation-state. A father and son on the run leave a wide footprint. But a father who vanishes into the wilderness? A son swallowed by the massive bureaucratic machinery of the state foster system? That was untraceable. I had to make you a random number in the system so they couldn't find you. I left you in the most public place I could find, directly under a security camera, knowing the state would take you in. It broke my soul, Silas. I sat in a rental car across the street from that Greyhound station for 2 days, watching through binoculars, crying until I couldn't breathe, making sure the police took you somewhere safe. I spent the next 18 years building this cabin, compiling the evidence, and watching you grow from afar. I hired a private intelligence firm out of Portland through a blind trust to take the photos on the wall. I needed to know you were okay. I couldn't interfere. I couldn't send money, or they would track the anomaly back to you. But I didn't leave you with nothing. In the ledger, you will find the account numbers for an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands, Kensington Row's silence money, heavily invested over 2 decades. It holds roughly $12 million. It is yours. The USB drive contains every soil sample, internal memo, and audio recording proving Kensington Row's crimes. It is the kill shot. Take it to William G. Bradley, a federal prosecutor in Seattle. His private address is on the back of this page. I am dying, Silas. The solvent exposure from my testing days has finally caught up with my lungs. I don't have much time left. But I die knowing that I outlasted them, and that my son is safe. Forgive me, if you can. Build a life, Silas. A beautiful, loud, fearless life. Love, Dad. Silas dropped the letter onto the leather desk blotter. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the heavy armchair, burying his face in his cold, dirt-stained hands. A raw, guttural sob tore from his throat. It was the sound of 18 years of grief, anger, and profound loneliness finally rupturing. He wept for the 5-year-old boy by the radiator. He wept for the father dying alone in this mountain fortress. And he wept for the sheer, staggering weight of the truth. He wasn't garbage. He was the most fiercely protected person on Earth. He sat there for hours as the darkness outside deepened, the reality of his new existence settling over him like a heavy mantle. He was a millionaire. He held the power to destroy a corrupt empire. But as he wiped his face and reached for the USB drive, a sudden, sharp sound shattered the silence of the cabin. Beep, beep, beep. It was coming from a small black panel near the door. A red light flashed in rhythm with the sound. It was a proximity alarm. Silas's blood ran cold. He remembered the fatal mistake he had made hours earlier. He had used his cheap, prepaid smartphone's GPS to navigate to the coordinates. His phone had been pinging cell towers all the way up the mountain. If Kensington Row had kept tabs on the Cole name, waiting for Richard to resurface or for Silas to stumble onto something, his sudden trip into the dead zones of the Cascades would have tripped every digital wire in their system. He wasn't alone in the woods. The sharp, rhythmic beep of the proximity alarm cut through the heavy silence of the cabin like a siren. A small, black digital panel, mounted beside the reinforced oak door, flashed a violently bright red. Silas's blood instantly turned to ice water. He scrambled backward, his mind racing to understand how a secret buried for 18 years had been unearthed in a matter of hours. Then, his eyes fell on his cracked, prepaid smartphone, resting on the mahogany desk. He had used its GPS to navigate the dead zones of the Cascades. His phone had been blindly pinging cell towers, desperately searching for a signal all the way up the mountain. If Kensington Row had maintained a digital dragnet on the Cole name, or on any anomalies connected to his known associates, like Thomas Grigsby's lumber yard, his sudden trajectory into the unmapped wilderness would have tripped every wire in their system. He killed his flashlight with a trembling thumb, plunging the room into shadows. Creeping toward the narrow, reinforced window, Silas pressed his cheek against the cold glass and peered through the swirling snow. 3 men were advancing across the clearing. They didn't move like hikers. They moved with terrifying, practiced, synchronized precision. They wore high-end, white winter tactical gear and carried suppressed, short-barreled rifles. The man in the center, older but possessing a terrifyingly calm demeanor, raised a gloved hand, signaling the others to fan out. Even without a photograph, Silas knew the face from his father's letter. It was Graham Kessler, the fixer, the man who had orchestrated the nightmare of the last 18 years. "Richard!" Kessler's voice drifted across the snowy clearing, amplified by the natural acoustics of the granite cliff. It was a smooth, conversational tone, devoid of urgency, which made it all the more horrifying. "Or is it the boy? It's been a long time, Silas. We got an alert when a phone registered to Thomas Grigsby's payroll suddenly made a beeline for a dead zone. We couldn't just let that go. Open the door, son. We just want the hard drives." Panic clawed at Silas's throat. He was a 23-year-old kid who sorted off cuts for minimum wage. He had no weapons. He had no training. But as he looked back at the corkboard, at the meticulous timeline of his lonely, miserable childhood, the terror crystallized into a burning, white-hot rage. These men had stolen his father. They had stolen his life. And now they had come to bury the truth in the snow. Silas grabbed the black USB drive and the velvet-covered ledger, shoving them deep into the zippered inside pocket of his coat. He zipped the jacket up to his chin. He remembered a crucial architectural detail from when he first approached the structure. The cabin was built perfectly flush against the solid granite cliff. A man as brilliant and deeply paranoid as Richard Cole wouldn't build a vault without a back door. Silas dropped to his hands and knees and scrambled under the heavy mahogany desk. He ran his bruised hands frantically along the hardwood floorboards, feeling for seams, for hinges, for anything. His fingers caught a slight depression beneath the edge of a woven wool rug. He yanked the rug aside, revealing a heavy, rusted iron ring set flush into the wood. Crack! The entire cabin shuddered. They were hitting the front door with a heavy breaching ram. Crack! The brass deadbolt, untested for nearly 2 decades, squealed a high-pitched protest. Dust rained down from the timber ceiling. Silas gripped the iron ring with both hands. He planted his boots against the floorboards and pulled with every ounce of physical strength he had developed hauling wet timber in clay alum. The trapdoor groaned, fought him for a second, and then violently gave way, swinging upward. A blast of freezing, damp air hit his face. It was a narrow earthen tunnel, carved directly into the bedrock and reinforced with heavy wooden beams. Crack! Wood splintered loudly. The hinges were giving way. "Don't make me tear this place apart, kid!" Kessler barked from the porch, his voice no longer friendly. Silas grabbed his backpack, slid feet first into the dark, narrow shaft, and reached up to pull the heavy trapdoor shut above him. The latch clicked into place at the exact second the cabin's front door exploded inward with a deafening crash. Silas held his breath in the suffocating darkness, suspended in the dirt tunnel. Above him, heavy boots stomped across the floorboards. "Clear!" a voice shouted. "He was just here." Kessler's voice resonated directly above Silas's head, so close Silas could hear the fabric of the man's coat rustling. "The desk chair is still warm. Find the drive. Check the floorboards." Silas didn't wait. He turned his phone screen onto its lowest brightness, just enough to illuminate the dirt a few inches ahead of his face, and began to crawl. The tunnel was agonizingly tight, sloping sharply downward, through the mountain's natural fissures. It felt like crawling through a grave. He scraped his shoulders against jagged rocks, his knees bleeding through his denim jeans. He crawled for what felt like hours, the air growing thinner, his muscles screaming in protest. Finally, the tunnel widened, ending abruptly at a heavy, rusted metal drainage grate concealed behind a thick, frozen curtain of mountain ivy. Silas kicked the grate with his boots until the rusted bolts sheared off. He tumbled out into a snowbank, gasping for air. He had bypassed the ridge entirely, emerging nearly 2 miles down the mountain from the cabin. He scrambled to his feet, powered entirely by adrenaline and pure spite. He ran through the waist-deep snow, using the dense, towering pine trees to mask his movements, navigating by instinct back toward the service road. When he finally broke through the tree line, his battered 1998 Ford Ranger was sitting exactly where he had left it. But his relief evaporated instantly. Standing beside the driver's side door, smoking a cigarette and casually holding a pistol, was a 4th mercenary, a scout left behind to watch the vehicle. Silas had no time to think. He dropped his backpack in the snow, picked up a heavy frozen branch the size of a baseball bat, and charged. The scout turned, his eyes widening in surprise, raising the pistol. Silas swung the frozen wood with everything he had, striking the man's forearm. The pistol discharged into the dirt, and the man crumpled with a shout of pain. Silas didn't wait to see if he would get back up. He dove into the cab, jammed the key into the ignition, and prayed. The engine sputtered, coughed, and roared to life. Silas slammed the truck into drive and tore down the logging road, the back tires fishtailing wildly on the black ice. In his rearview mirror, he saw the scout scrambling for a radio, but it was too late. Silas had the momentum. He didn't go back to his trailer. He didn't stop for gas until he was safely across county lines, blending into the heavy, anonymous traffic of Interstate 90. He drove straight through the night, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes darting to every set of headlights in his mirrors. At 7 a.m. the next morning, as the city of Seattle was just waking up, a bruised, muddy, and exhausted Silas Cole walked into the sterile, polished reception area of the federal prosecutor's office. He refused to leave until William G. Bradley was pulled from a morning briefing. Bradley, an older, sharp-eyed man in a tailored suit, walked out into the lobby, clearly annoyed. He looked Silas up and down, taking in the torn jacket and the dirt on his face. "Who are you, and why are you demanding to see me?" Bradley asked, his voice clipped. Silas reached into his coat, pulled out the polished black USB drive and the velvet ledger, and placed them gently on the glass reception desk. "My name is Silas Cole. My father was Richard Cole, lead hydrogeologist for Kensington Row," Silas said, his voice raspy yet steady. "On that drive is the unredacted groundwater data, internal memos, and the financial trail proving they poisoned the Eastern Basin. The ledger contains the offshore accounts they used to pay off the assassins who tried to kill him." Bradley stared at the drive, the color slowly draining from his face. "Kensington Row. We've been trying to build a case on them for a decade. They're ghosts." "They aren't ghosts," Silas said, looking Bradley dead in the eye. "And neither am I. I want Graham Kessler in federal prison by midnight, and I want my father's name cleared." The fallout was catastrophic, swift, and completely unprecedented. By noon, the Department of Justice had mobilized a task force. By 3 p.m., federal agents raided Kensington Row's corporate headquarters. The encrypted data on the USB drive was undeniable, detailing not only the illegal dumping of the toxic solvent, but a massive, multi-million-dollar cover-up. Graham Kessler was intercepted by U.S. Marshals at a private airfield, just as he was attempting to board a charter flight to Dubai. Silas Cole watched the breaking news from a secure, high-rise hotel suite paid for by the DOJ. The company's stock was in a freefall. Executives were being perp-walked on national television, and the $12 million offshore trust was quietly, legally secured under his name. He stood by the window, looking out over the glittering skyline of Seattle. For 18 years, he had been a boy left by a radiator, convinced he was entirely alone in the world. Now, with a heavy ledger in his hands and a legacy of immense bravery behind him, Silas knew the truth. He had never been discarded. He had been the most fiercely protected person on earth. Silas Cole no longer haunted the edges of the world. With the corrupt corporation dismantled and his father's name fully cleared, the multi-million-dollar inheritance was merely a footnote to his true victory. He purchased the Spokane bus station, transforming it into a vibrant shelter for forgotten youth. Looking at the brass key on his desk, Silas finally understood the truth. He was never abandoned. He was hidden and fiercely loved.